Good morning, everybody, to Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School. Today we have John Jones with us, and we are looking forward to the presentation and discussion. And Peter is going to lead us into prayer introduction. Thank you, Peter.
Okay, just a second to have to get this, got it. Okay. Good morning to all, and welcome to the Sabbath School. A powerful image that is coming to us from the book of Revelation that we studied for several Sabbaths. It's the image of the throne of God. It's the majesty of God, beauty, and it's something that it's hard to describe. This image is also present in the book of Daniel. The throne of God, it's surrounded by thousands upon thousands upon thousands of angels and creatures. And what they are doing, they are worshiping. This is the main idea that should remain with us. They are worshiping God for his holiness, for his majesty. They are worshiping Jesus Christ, his son, the lamb that was slain and that was able to break the seals and to open the book. There was nobody in heaven or under heaven that was able to do this. Only Jesus was able to do this. And all creatures and all angels, all of them were worshiping. Well, my thinking of this is that, and prayer in the same time, is that God allowed us also to be participant in that big crowd at the end that will worship the Lamb and God the Father. And our Bible reading today, it's from the book of Daniel, chapter 7, verses 9 to 14. I will be reading from New International Version. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. Let 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain and his body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts have been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night, I looked. There before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was giving authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, all nations, and men and every language worship him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Amen. Let us pray. Merciful Father, thank you for all your blessings. Thank you for the gift of the Sabbath. Please accept our gratitude because we recognize that all that we are and all that we have is coming from your loving hands. Please bless us all today, and a special blessing especially upon Dr. John Jones, that is going to be our presenter. I ask and pray for all of this in Jesus' precious name. Amen.
Amen. Yeah, good morning to everyone, and thank you, Peter, for getting us off.
Good morning. Just a second, John. I have to introduce you a little bit. I know that you want to be anonymous, but there's no way with our class. Dr. John Jones, it's a third generation of Seventh-day Adventists. He was raised in the Philippine Islands, where his parents were missionaries teaching at Philippine Union College. John got his bachelor degree at Walla Walla College and then master degree at Andrews University. After graduating, John and his wife Pat went to Napa, California, where they spent a year for a pastoral internship. After this, they got a call from Hong Kong Adventist Theological Seminary, and John was for 5 years chair of the department, and Pat was putting together their nursing program. After 5 years of service in Hong Kong, they returned to the States, and they pursued their master's and PhD programs at Vanderbilt University. After graduation, they returned to Asia and spent 9 more years there, working for the Far Eastern Division in their theological seminary. Pat was putting together a graduate nursing program for them. That was happening in 1978. Then in 1987, John and Pat came to Loma Linda, where they are still living today. And John accepted a position, administrative position, as special assistant for the vice president of academic administration. Pat was teaching in the School of Nursing. In 1990, the two campuses, Loma Linda and La Sierra, separated, and John accepted the position of chair of, chair of department, where he's in the chair of the Department of Religion, where he served for several years. After this, he decided that he will return to his first love, which was teaching, and which is still, I think, teaching today. And Pat continued her work as teaching in the School of Nursing, and also a special associate director for the General Conference for the Health Program. John, his specialty is in New Testament, and also he is very interested in Asian religions. In his spare time, he has some hobbies that it's pursuing. He's ethnomusicologue. He's collecting folkloric music, and also he's interested in languages. He's leading also tours in fascinating places like Tibet and the Silk Road. They have two daughters that are both academically accomplished. And now, John, we are ready for your words of wisdom.
I don't know about the wisdom, Peter, but thank you thank you for the introduction, and thank you for getting us off to such a good spiritual beginning here this morning. That's important and helpful, and I'm very grateful to you. So, first of all, how is the audio coming through? Is it okay? Yeah, all right, thank you. And let's see if we can get right into a share screen here. I think that will get us started. Can we do that? Yeah, here we go. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right, thank you. You see here, my voice has chosen this moment to rebel. Stay with me a moment here. Thank you for your patience with that. Okay, so you see a copy here of the opening page of the Apocalypse of John in the Gutenberg Bible. And of course, we have been studying that this quarter, and so it's appropriate. Let's see, I'm going to, I can see I'm going to have problems with advancing my screens here. Okay. I may just have to leave those advanced screens on the left margin. That seems to be the only way. Oh, here we go. All right. All right, let's get into the slideshow here a bit. And so thank you for the opportunity here at the end of the quarter for us to sort of think together a little bit. On behalf of Forrest Howe and myself, thanks for the invitation. We will be talking this week and next in relationship, at least in conversation, with Bart Ehrman about his book on Armageddon, and we'll so he will pick up the ball and give it one more kick next Sabbath. And I'm glad for that. I appreciate his collegial friendship, and maybe next Sabbath we'll have a few more members in participation. I think we have a little bit of competition with another activity here this Sabbath as well. So here we go. Reading Revelation together with Bart Ehrman. Ehrman, as you know, is professor of New Testament studies, University of North Carolina. And he's written or edited a good 30-some books. I think this is his 33rd. So he's a very popular author. He writes heavy scholarly stuff for the professional audience, but he also brings out these books which are aimed more at ordinary people like us. This one, which is just out this year, has 8 chapters, and it traces his pilgrimage, shall we say, with the book of Revelation through 3 different stages in his own life. And the book is divided in half. The first 4 chapters deal with the first couple of stages in his life. And the last 4, particularly 6, 7, and 8, the last 3 particularly, deal with the 3rd stage in his own personal pilgrimage with the book of Revelation. So we'll begin for a minute here and do a little bit with the first 4 chapters, and then we'll spend a little more focused attention on the last 4 chapters of his book. He begins, and I must apologize. Bart Ehrman has a number of videos on YouTube, as many of you are aware, including 2 or 3 now on this book. The one that is the longest and most comprehensive or complete is one that he did back last September. And as a result, I think he was still finishing up his last few chapters in the book. And so that video on YouTube doesn't concentrate as much on the chapters I want to concentrate on as much today. So I did not give you an assignment to view those, any of his YouTube videos, although you are most welcome. If you just go to YouTube and type Ehrman and Armageddon, it will get you to several of his. It is a challenge when we're talking about a book. We find ourselves with a number of screens full of text material, and that's a very, very poor way to do a PowerPoint presentation, is to put a bunch of textual stuff up on the screen and then read it. I will try to kind of skip through, but in the reading, so that you're not bored with word by word readings, but at least we'll get the gist of what he wants to say. And so he opens up by tracing his own experience by saying that he started out as a kid in the 1970s. He was actually 17 years old, I think, when he had a kind of a conversion experience. And as a committed evangelical Christian, he says, I considered every word of the Bible inspired and true, and I heartily embraced a literal reading of the prophecies of Revelation, convinced that they showed beyond any doubt that Jesus was soon to return from heaven. And then there would be hell to pay, at least to those who, unlike me, were not true believers. We recognize the voice of a brother here, in a way, yeah. And and in so doing, that way of reading involved at least what we would call the futurist approach. We'll be talking about 4 different ways of reading Revelation here this morning, but he focused on the futurist, which is to say that all of the prophecies and everything in Revelation is focused toward the closing episodes, closing years of Earth history before the time of the end. I've also put alongside that the historical, by which I mean the continuous historical way of reading, which kind of spreads out the history that Revelation foretells, much as we are familiar with as Seventh-day Adventists, working through the 7 churches in order there, and that in turn, as he worked with that way, he eventually came to the point of struggling with that and having some difficulties with it. There are problems with the historical approach, the continuous historical, and one of these is that the thing that really kicked off Protestant readings of Revelation, and they had started before already with the Reformation, but particularly gave impetus through the French Revolution and associated democratic rebellions and upheavals around the world. It convinced a lot of people that the time of the end was upon us, that was a real watershed. And another aspect of all of this was the rise of dispensationalism. John Darby, a Scottish pastor in the 1800s, came up with the idea of two returns of Jesus, one before the millennium and one after. We have kind of inherited that from him in some way. And particularly the idea of dispensationalism, which was popularized particularly in the 1900s with the Scofield Reference Bible. Darby had, in a very thoughtful and observant and reflective way, come up with a kind of a theological historical scheme many of you are familiar with in principle, if not in detail, that somehow God has related to the human race in different ways in different periods. Now, all of us have something of that idea in the distinction between the Old Testament and the New Testament. But Darby divided it a little more finely, as you can see here in these 7 eras, and that has really taken hold among many evangelical Protestants still to this day. And Ehrman was a devout disciple of this model as well, and paid a lot of attention to it. An important aspect of that was the idea of the rapture, that at the time of the first of Christ's returns, people are caught up in glory, some included and some excluded, and you all are familiar with that, particularly through popular stuff, books and movies and so forth, as you can see. And so the result of all of that was that actually, while Ehrman was deeply devout and fully committed to this, he became disillusioned with it a little bit eventually, just because of this. You see what the result is. And I could easily have filled up the screen 2 or 3 more times with just as many books in recent times. And all of this, these constant prophecies, breathless, on the threshold of the time of the end, and then having to rewrite the books and make new prophecies and so forth. And a lot of people have become kind of disillusioned with that. And frankly, Ehrman did too, finally. And he had to step back and say, wait a minute, we need to think again about this. So in doing that, he takes his opening chapters of his book to trace out the work of people like Hal Lindsey and Tim LaHaye and John Hagee and others, including, he spends something more than 20 pages reviewing the history of the Millerite movement and also of the events with the Branch Davidians at Waco. And he recounts that history really in quite a sympathetic and understanding way. He does not condemn the Adventists or Advent movement. He rather does some of the others, but he's quite sympathetic with the Adventists. And finally, when he comes to the end, his closing summative evaluation of the Millerite to Waco branch, he simply says this: those of us who watch such events unfold, as has happened at Waco, he means, have no difficulty seeing the narcissism of messianic pretenders. But what about the millions of regular old folks, our friends, families, neighbors, who also genuinely believe they're living the fulfillment of prophecy? Are they delusional too when they claim that God's eternal plan is now coming to fulfillment for them in particular, and that they're the ones predicted by the ancient prophecies of God? And he simply steps back then and he says, I try not to pass moral judgment on anyone who believes this way, these things. All of us are almost certainly wrong about one thing or another when it comes to ultimate reality. But then he does add a little word of caution. He says, you know, the belief that the divine plan of the entire human race has now climaxed with us, lucky us, is, if not delusional, at least a bit narcissistic. Narcissists, like their eponymous ancestor, do not see what is in the water when they gaze into it, or for that matter, what's in the Bible. They see themselves. And he says that's not always disastrous, but it is nearly always sad. I quote him not particularly with approval, but since he deals with our movement in a certain section for a few pages in his book, I thought I should take his kind of conclusion about the whole matter of our particular history and simply share it with you. He knows Adventists, he knows us well. He and I have had a couple of rather brief exchanges at professional society meetings, but he has had some Adventists as students at North Carolina University, and so he knows us, and I think he feels a certain kind of kinship for us as well, even though I think he would probably say that he has moved beyond anything in his experience that resembles ours. At any rate, moving along now, there are some reservations that emerge in his book concerning the historical, critical, or the continuous historical and the futurist interpretations. One of his reservations, or on one level, is methodological. The problem is, and we have to acknowledge he's got a point here. As time goes by, if you have, for example, the 7 churches, and time is going by, as time passes on and we see these 7 churches fulfilled, you come down to a closure, a decreasing set of interpretive options, all of which has to be fit into the last church, the Laodicean. I think maybe a greater issue for people who want to read Revelation in a very sequential way is that it's really hard to get sequencing or structure out of the book of Revelation. And we Adventists, we have all recognized this. But but because Revelation has so many repetitions and kind of goes in circles and reinforcement of different phases, the result is that some people wind up just throwing up their hands and just going from hopping and skipping around, not only in Revelation, but throughout the Bible, to find little pieces here and there that they can combine in some creative or clever way. And he says that treats the whole Bible like a kind of a jigsaw puzzle, and that does have problems. And I must admit, we should hear his caution on that, I think, a little bit. Maybe the greater issues are the outcomes. I think that many evangelicals in North America have, because of their way of reading particularly the ancient conditional prophecies to Isaiah and Jeremiah, prophesying that Israel would return. And, these were conditional prophecies and I think have been supplanted by the New Testament, when God has a different kind of historical plan in mind, that we as a people, as Americans, have been guilty, I think, of misapplying some of the scriptures, particularly in the Old Testament, to the modern situation in the Middle East today in ways that are blind to the moral and ethical impacts of our decisions as an American government. Another example of equal irresponsibility, I would suggest, is when the time is short, we we forget what Revelation says. God in Revelation says, I will destroy them that destroy the earth. But we are guilty. I don't mean we as Adventists necessarily, but I mean as Americans, we've often been guilty of destroying the earth for selfish, greedy reasons, and rationalizing it. Well, the time is about finished, and in the next generation or two, God is going to come and destroy it all anyway. And I think there's an ethical problem with that kind of thing. He suggests that on pages 102 and 103 in his book as well. So these are just quick passing notes of some problems that he sees in futurist and continuous historical readings. But more, perhaps moving along somewhat more importantly, as he tells his story, I put up the first paragraph that we've read already. And then the second paragraph follows that. After some years, he says, I engaged in a more rigorous study of the Bible. I came to see the difficulties of this view, namely of the futurist and continuous historical readings, and began to explore the book of Revelation from a more historical perspective. Now, let me stress those words, and then I'll pick up in a moment to see what he means by that. He says, I realized why it was important to understand the work of the book of Revelation in its own context in relation to other ancient Jewish and Christian books collectively called apocalypses, you know? And he goes on to explain that these are endlessly fascinating works that give us visions of things to come with the goal of providing a certain comfort to us. Now, in doing that, we need to recognize that he's talking about the way the book should be read from a more historical perspective. And let me unpack that with you for just a moment, where he's headed. Here is a distinction that Adventists have often not made very well between the classic prophetic model and the apocalyptic model. The classic prophetic model was one of after the Israelites, the Jews, I will say, come back from Babylon, they anticipated that they were going to get really serious about building up again the walls of Jerusalem and restoring the temple and the rituals and ceremonies there, obeying the law, observing Sabbath, and so forth. And things little by little would get better and better along the way. Yeah, we do that too, don't we? America the Beautiful, we speak above the purple mountain majesties, above the fruited plain, and so forth. But if you remember the words of that, by the time we get to the fourth verse, we have America somehow undimmed by human tears. Yeah, we've got a ways to go yet, don't we, in this country, where we realize that vision. And, you know, the Jewish people did the same thing. When coming back from their captivity in Babylon, they were so determined that they would collaborate with God and actualize the divine plan. And things would get better and better along the way until finally we would reach the level that God would restore Eden, so to speak, before the fall. And of course, as we know, things didn't quite work out that way. And you instead of getting better and better, things got worse and worse and went downhill. And people built their own homes before they built the temple. And the idea that you would live longer and longer until, if you die at the age of 100, you would still be a young person, and all of that. Instead of all of that improvement, there was a kind of a decline, and things got worse and worse. And the result is a different model, a different understanding of history, a different scheme in which the approach of the restored world came not through things improving, but declining until the cup of iniquity would be filled up. And at that point, then God would step in and say, okay, that's enough. That's enough. And God blows the whistle on the human race, so to speak, and then just destroys and wipes out sin, and God steps in without human contribution to an improved world. Things get worse, and the result then is that the worse things get, the better it is, because the shorter the time is, until God finally just draws a line across all of history and creates a new heaven and a new earth. A very different model. Now, traditionally, Adventists have not fully appreciated the implications of that difference. William Miller could only speak of the biblical prophecies, and he sort of combined them all together into one phenomenon. But moving on, we can see that the apocalyptic writings have a certain set of assumptions that are different from the prophetic ones. And I'll just throw these up here quickly. A moral decline, that things are going downhill. There are two ages, the present age and the coming age. And the time is set, and only God knows the time, but there are certain indications. The prophecies are of things that are happening recently. That is just when, certain kings and certain things happening. And the prophet who sees these visions has an angel who joins along his side and explains them. And cosmic conflict model is really important. The great final clash between good and evil, and warnings, to human beings to repent and so forth. Now there are this kind of writing with this model and these characteristic features. When we look at these features, we find that there are quite a number of books in ancient times that have some or more of these different characteristic features. They are clustered. They're clustered around a few hundred years before Jesus and 200, at most, maybe say 300 years after Jesus. And I've only quickly thrown up on the screen here just a few of the main ones by way of illustrating the whole phenomenon. There are more. I didn't put them all up by any means. And in fact, Forrest next week will help us think about these writings a little more and fill in the picture a little more. This particular style of thinking in the period around the time of Christ. The ones on the left are Jewish: Daniel, Enoch, the Sibylline oracles, the Testament of the 12 patriarchs. I've put them below the green line. Enoch, second Baruch, the Assumption of Moses, third Baruch, fourth Ezra, or second Esdras, as it's also called. These are all originally, at least, Jewish documents in the apocalyptic model. But a number of them got reworked by Christians. And there were a number of examples where Christians took Jewish apocalypses and then added Christian insertions or re-edited them in some direction. That's particularly the case with the Sibylline oracles. You see these little arrows I've put here on the left side, and over on the right hand side, more of the same, now in a more Christian way. In addition, there are books that are from the beginning written as Christian writings that are apocalyptic. Certainly the synoptic apocalypse in Matthew, Mark, and Luke would belong to that category. Certainly the book of Revelation, but also the Shepherd of Hermas, the apocalypse of Peter, the apocalypse of Paul, and there are others that didn't get into the biblical canon. I'm just doing this really quickly in passing. As I say, Forrest can fill in the picture a little more. But the idea is to get out in front of us a collection of writings. And if we expanded it beyond Judaism and Christianity, we would find others of a similar kind of writing, or at least with certain similar features in Asia Minor, in Mesopotamia, in Persia, even, yet at the same time. We would remind ourselves that the Babylonian captivity, Jewish thinkers were exposed to some of that kind of writing. And if we go on even further east, even into India, we find certain even Buddhist writings, which have a different kind of historical model, still picking up on some of those same ideas. This is a particular time period marked by particular understandings of history, some of which comes into our scripture, some of which does not. I'm not pretending at all that all of these are inspired, but they do reflect a similar kind of characteristic literary features. So go back and take a look at the types of readings now. We can find that we can add one more to the category. Now, in addition to the futurist and the continuous historical, we have what's called the preterist, which is a way of referencing apocalyptic types of writings to the time period in which they were written, with the assumption that at least their initial meaning refers to things that are happening at the time of their writing. And Ehrman kind of unpacks that a little bit to explain further in a paragraph like this one on page 28 of his book. He says that John's revelation was through a vision about what will take place soon. And then Ehrman says he names the intended recipients, the 7 churches. You know them well: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, and so forth. He says John was writing to 7 groups of Christians that he personally knew, not to people living 2,000 years later in North America. Yeah, this is the classic statement of a classic preterist reading. Now, when he says he has seen a vision about what will take place soon, he means soon for his actual readers. He doesn't mean thousands of years from now. And mostly when Ehrman writes this way, he has the people in mind of the futurists, of which we've seen a lot. He's not thinking so much of the continuous historical model, but I suppose he would say something similar nonetheless. But that's the idea. The meaning of the text is the meaning that it held when it was originally written. In other words, the question for us to ask is, what did it mean to the author when he wrote it? And what was he thinking? Now, there are indications that, of course, the book of Revelation does indeed have valid meaning for its time and place, right there. And in fact, if we take a map of these 7 churches here in Western Turkey, we recognize that when we read the 7 churches in order, name them, they go this way: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. And we know that it was standard practice, and that the author anticipates that his letter will be taken by someone. The photocopy machines didn't work very well in those days. They don't work altogether well in our time today, but the idea was a copy of this would be taken and someone would travel in this loop, in this way, in this order. And that's why the sequence is what it is. And would read. And so to the church at Ephesus, here's what I know about you. You at Smyrna, yeah. You at Pergamos, you need to look out, and so forth, right down to Laodicea. In fact, while we're looking at Laodicea, this is a really interesting little point. The idea that they are neither hot nor cold, let me just read you from our SDA Bible commentary. One of the chief landmarks of the vicinity of Laodicea, the geographical church there, was a waterfall over which a stream from the hot springs at Hierapolis plunged. It was a hot spring. The water came out, and going along the aqueduct, it grew cooler on its way across the valley to Laodicea, about 6 miles away. And when the water reached that city, it was lukewarm. And so Laodiceans knew all about lukewarm water, and they knew it was neither hot nor cold, and not very satisfying to drink. And people who were new there and visited wanted to just spit it out. And so, it may be indeed that when John is conveying this message from God to the church at Laodicea, their water supply is an illustration of spiritual carelessness, but it certainly was an apt example just the same. That's from our own SDA Bible commentary. Now let me see if I can get this to advance here. Here we go. And so now we wind up finally with 4 classic approaches. We looked first at the futurist and the continuous historical, these 2 middle ones. But now Ehrman is saying, I'm reading more historically now. And when he says that, he means as a preterist. He's asking himself, okay, what did the text mean when it was first written? And that does not preclude the possibility, as the centuries go on, to reapply in secondary applications. Not that the definitive meaning is to be found in preterist readings, but certainly there is room for reapplications along the way. That was something that Des Ford struggled with. He was trying to ask new questions about how we should read Revelation. And he said, we need to recognize that there's a possibility for reapplications along the way. And in fact, so does the Bible commentary, SDA Bible commentary. I'm quoting again from that same page in volume 7. It says, the Laodicean message is applicable, for example, to all who profess to be Christians. No matter when we live, we need to be thinking about these things, right? So when we think about this model, we need to recognize that there are potentials for more than one pair of eyeglasses when we read. In fact, when I was teaching in Hong Kong, my Chinese students were very excited by the great dragon in Revelation. And I had to explain to them, well, Chinese dragons and Revelation dragon are 2 different kinds of things. This is a bad dragon in chapter 13, and it's destroying the saints. Whereupon my students immediately turned around and said, okay, now we get it. That dragon represents Mao Zedong. Because when I was teaching in Hong Kong, Mao Zedong was very busy persecuting the Christians and killing them. And so for them, that's what I would call a symbolic or idealist. Anytime you recognize a particular phenomenon in history that matches what you read in the Bible, you see opportunities for meaning. And so moving quickly now on through this, the preterist reading derives from a particular scholarly approach that says that the meaning of the text is to be found by establishing authorial intent. The real question of what a text meant must come first. Then we can ask what it means, but we must always start by asking what it meant. Now, in a way, this was a conservative move on the part of scholars, starting in the 1800s, particularly, to get some standards by way and some controls over how we read the text And so the criterion of authorial intent became very important in doing that. There are problems though. In order to get at what the original author originally meant, you need all kinds of background. You need to know how to read the original language. You need the cultural settings. You need to know about the rituals, and you need to understand the literary genre. Is this prophecy? Is it apocalyptic? Whatever. And once again, it places the Bible beyond the reach of people, ordinary lay people, and it becomes a frustration. Moving along quickly here. And so Ehrman says, well, he read the book as prophecy of the future, a futurist reading. And he says, that's how I taught the book when I began my career. But then he later says, I couldn't do that anymore. I had to move beyond that. I had to abandon this understanding. It was not easy for me. It was difficult. So he says, now moving into the second part of my book, I show why I don't think Revelation provides a comforting message for the vast majority of those who suffer in this life. John describes the Battle of Armageddon and so forth. A follower of Jesus, he was, but we need to ask new and different questions along the way. So moving now into the four chapters, second half of the book. Here is a different model, not of meaning starting with what the author meant and arriving at what it means for us, but that rather meaning happens in the middle, in the encounter between the text and the reader. Meaning becomes then an event, so to speak. And this gets a little technical, but I'll try to go through it. Here are some statements of my own. I'm skipping down through some quick statements to, I'm not quoting from Ehrman now, but these are the understandings he's working from, but I'm summarizing. From this perspective, Revelation is composed with a postulated reader. That is, Revelation is aimed at a particular kind of reader, a certain mentality, a certain perspective. And so, on the other hand, any reader comes with his own interests and perspectives. In other words, meaning emerges in the middle between text and reader as an event. And I'm suggesting then that we as readers have choices as to whether and to what extent we want to enter into the role of the text's implied reader. The text sets us up, but it's up to us whether we want to walk in through that door or not. Quickly, here is John Lindbeck, a theologian writing in 1984. It's not the case that believers find their stories in the Bible. Rather, they make the story of the Bible their story. Notice what he's saying. The development is from text to reader. It's the religion instantiated in Scripture that defines what is truth and goodness and beauty. And the non-scriptural exemplifications need to be transformed into figures of the scriptural ones. It's the text which absorbs the world rather than the world absorbing the text. Now, if we go back further to 1931, here's Virginia Woolf, literary scholar, not necessarily Christian. Our first duty as readers is to try to understand what the writer's making. We must not impose our design upon him. We must not try to make him conform his will to ours. Similar paragraphs in a way, each in their own language. Now, watch what happens in the next paragraph in each case. On the left, Lindbeck, theologian, he says there's always the danger that the extra biblical materials inserted into the biblical universe and by our own minds even, will themselves become the basic framework of interpretation. And that's a danger, he says. We have to protect against that. Always work from text first. Virginia Woolf, by contrast, however, and no matter what she's just said here, adds in the next paragraph, reading is a complex art. It doesn't merely consist in sympathizing and understanding. It also consists in criticizing and judging. The reader must leave the dock, that is to say, the witness chair, and mount the bench, that is to say, the judge's chair. He must cease to be the friend. He must become the judge. Now, there's the fork in the road, huh? Isn't that interesting? Now that sets up for us, how do we come to the text? Because the text is inspired word. For us to hold any reservations about it feels transgressive to us. On the other hand, Virginia Woolf says, yeah, you've got to be able to exercise your own judgment along the way. And so here now quoting from Ehrman, when people read the Bible, they tend to see what they want to see. Revelation is often read with sympathetic eyes by those who don't expect to see anything problematic in Scripture. That's true of many Christian lay people, but even Christian scholars are convinced that there's nothing really wrong with God destroying most of the humans on the planet by having them thrown into a lake of fire. Ehrman says, I can't hang on to that any longer. He, in his own pilgrimage, and I'm not advocating him, I'm just quickly capitulating his pilgrimage through the book as he writes. He says, I don't see it that way any longer. He says, when I get to Revelation, the God of Revelation is not all loving, not even close. Neither is the Christ of Revelation. They only favor Jesus' devoted followers, and all others are tormented and destroyed, including many Christians that John doesn't agree with. One of the critical issues seems to be whether they eat food that's offered to idols, in opposition to Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. They're all tossed in the lake of fire. And so he says, it's ironic that many readers think, as I once did, that the God portrayed here is greater than any human sense of right or wrong. But if our sense of right and wrong reveals the character of God, what if God's moral code requires him to torture and destroy those he disapproves of? Yeah, if God's like that and we're told to be godly people, maybe we should imitate him. If God hates those who refuse to be his slaves, that's douloi, that's the Greek word in the text, and hurts and destroys them, maybe we should do the same? Or should we rather disagree with Revelation is the implication? I'm going to skip through some of this, but it is a bit hard to swallow, I'll admit, as the bookworms say. Jesus, Ehrman quickly compares in one of his chapters the Gospels Jesus and the Revelation Jesus. Yeah. Jesus in the Gospels proclaims that the kingdom is coming soon. If people want to enter into it, they need to repent or they'll be destroyed. But we need to notice that this is an apocalyptic image, but it's reported as good news, not bad news. It's a message of hope, of salvation. He says, God does indeed portray God, Jesus does indeed portray God as a judge, and God will certainly condemn those who do not turn to him. But it's important to stress, in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and especially John, which stresses God's love, salvation comes to those who accept Jesus' call to live differently, who live as God directs in service. Notice the principle of service rather than riches and domination and ruling over others and material rewards. Salvation in the Gospels is based on the commandment to love. And so he says this phenomenon has real life consequences. Not only do people interested in Jesus paint him in their own image, they then model their lives on the image of Jesus that they've painted. Those who see Jesus as a pacifist tend to oppose war and work for peace. That is to say, Jesus of the Gospels, huh? Those who see Jesus as an advocate for the poor and needy often engage in volunteer work to bring justice and so forth. What about the portrait of Jesus that shows him in Revelation? That's vengeful, angry, powerful, dominating. Jesus who once suffered but now destroyed. Jesus is concerned with incredible displays of material wealth. And he mentions particularly the idea of everlasting punishment, which has also been offensive to us as Adventist people. We have it from Ellen White that the idea of everlasting punishment and endless torment and suffering is not right. And I think it is offensive to our sense of morality and justice. And so the Ehrman amplifies this to suggest that the larger picture of Jesus and God who go on and on tormenting and with persecution. And the word love does not appear one time in the book of Revelation, interestingly enough, unlike the Gospels, is a real contrast, they suggest. The God of Revelation, Jesus, Revelation is not the Jesus of the Gospels. It's the portrait, however, of Christ that many people prefer today. And this is important. It's a portrait that enables and encourages Jesus' followers to embrace violence, vengeance, domination, exploitation, to do whatever it takes to assert their will on others. Some of these people have been our neighbors. Some of them have been our leaders. Some of them very much want to be our leaders. And so he asks, what would the Jesus of the Gospels make of that? You know? And I think that's really the pertinent question that emerges from his book. The choices that confront us, he doesn't spell them out in further detail, but it's clear. In our own lives, we have choices, a choice of joining, for example, Doctors Without Borders or other service organizations, ADRA, going and serving with our own two hands, or these guys who have been reading the book of Revelation in certain ways, you see. Ehrman is onto something there. Other SDA examples of moral choices, I would give you quickly 3 in closing. And this is my closing thing now. One example is to choose to read, even within Revelation, the textual strata that fit in with our moral criterion. In the case of Kendra, she has worked in her doctoral dissertation with reference to the work of Mikhail Bakhtin with the hymnic materials that are scattered. If your printing of your book of Revelation quotes the hymns of the redeemed, we can see that they sing the united worship in heaven and in the hereafter. And she shows how that reflects the worship life of early Christian congregations. In other words, the hymns in Revelation are drawn from the hymn books of the early church. And that there are theological implications for this of exaltation and praise, divine glory and worthiness. There are ethical considerations, and even in liturgical life, there is that integration. Heaven and earth are collapsed together. Even it's been said that that apocalyptic literature is persecution literature, written for communities under hardship and persecution, but that these hymns collapse the present time with the future time and help Christians under persecution to sing with the angels around the throne of God, the song of Moses and the Lamb and of the redeemed, and so that when they walk out from church service, they can hold their heads high, knowing that they are sons and daughters of God and that they are to be delivered. Earth and heaven are united together. Present and future are collapsed together. Kendra has made a deliberate ethical choice to focus on the hymnic portions of Revelation with a strong positive ethical outcome from that. And I am acknowledging that. Sigve Tonstad, I'm referencing his commentary. It's it would be a lot to try to quote many examples across the pages, but my point in putting this on the screen one more time is that there are places where Sigve will interpret a particular aspect of some vision or symbol from a preterist perspective. There are times when he uses a continuous historical perspective, a particular period in the church's history over 2,000 years. There are times when he will use the so-called futurist perspective, and there are times definitely when he uses an idealistic pair of eyeglasses in interpreting the text. In other words, he gives himself the freedom to use all of the various perspectives in ways that can bring a blessing to the church. And he's not bound or constricted to any particular one of them. That's interesting. Although I will say again that in our own SDA Bible commentary, they do the same thing. They will use continuous historical readings, but they will sometimes use what we would call symbolic or idealist readings as well. So we as Adventists should give ourselves permission, I think, to do that. And Sigve is an excellent example of the spiritual benefits that can come out of that kind of perspectival freedom. Or again, just recently, in a series of articles this past quarter by Hans Gutierrez on what he calls a kenotic eschatology. Kenotic means emptying, a kind of humble eschatology, if you please, in which he says, well, okay, we can take Revelation, but don't take it alone. We need to modify it in conversation with other perspectives, other moral principles, other books of the Bible. It's a very insightful series of essays, and I've just quoted one piece here as an example of an SDA freedom to go beyond Revelation's perspective. The end of the world cannot be revenge. It's not just vindication. It's not just God's power. The end will be an act of humility. That's the kenotic aspect. We see God's sadness, flexibility, compassion, surrender to love. He says it's not a muscular moment of God asserting power through justified bullying. Yeah, and he gives some examples of why. He then goes on and says, these are the extremes of a slow eschatology, a kenotic eschatology. By slow, he means that can borrow from many periods of church history and bring them all together. A typical Adventist interpretation of the end as righteousness and justice, emphasizing holiness and obedience, is a kind of fast eschatology. Even if it's 2,000 years, it scrunches everything together toward the end. He says this doesn't make it illegitimate, but it doesn't express the whole biblical view of the end. And so if we're not careful, our eschatology can become illegitimate if it wants to claim that it's the one and only biblical way. Openness to others, to other churches, cannot take place within Adventism unless experiential and alternative readings also emerge. He's saying we need to have some breadth in our understandings, even as the Bible has breadth in its understandings. Adventism doesn't have an eschatological monopoly. It also doesn't have a monopoly on the Sabbath or even on God. Yeah. Adventist eschatology, besides being an interpretation, is only an honest testimony about the end, not an absolute and definitive description of it. And so finally, he says, a kenotic eschatology must be able to be matched by a kenotic ecclesiology, a humble view of the church. If the message is kenotic, the messenger cannot be swaggering, much less overbearing. You've been patient sitting through all of this, but it's an attempt to enter into some conversation, with Ehrman, to report to you as a class something of his book, and also at the same time share the Adventist eyeglasses through which I read when I read him. And so I think we need some time to talk. Thank you for hanging in here with me. Where shall we begin? Let's close down the shared screen here and go back to our group conversation. Yeah. Mm.
Thank you so much, John. This was truly
Thank you.
fascinating. And I'm sure there will be plenty of questions to follow. It is our habit to take a short break so that the speaker can rest a little bit as well. And so I'm proposing it's 11:40. So I'm sure we have lots of questions. So I'm going to make this a very short break, maybe 5 minutes. So let's come back at 11:45. Thank you.
Yeah.
So we're back from our short break, and we have a discussion with John, who gave us a very interesting presentation. And Monty will lead us in the discussion as usual. But before we start, I have a question for you, John. So where do you find the importance in the revelation for your own life?
Ah, yes, right. Yeah, I think you asked the question rightly and appropriately after taking you all through this hour long. I think yeah, I would say over the years, I too have had a pilgrimage with Revelation. Maybe not necessarily the same as Bart Ehrman's, but enough so that even as he understands Adventists, I would say in some way, I understand him, even though I don't necessarily walk every step with him. I think over the years, I have had to come to the point of asking myself, how do I hold together the picture in Revelation and the picture in the Gospels? Yeah. And I have to say that for me, Revelation is a signal, a flag of the seriousness of the human condition and of the seriousness of the choices that we make. There are many people who call themselves liberals who simply mean that they don't take their faith or the human condition or the history of the world or of salvation, plan of salvation, they don't take seriously. I can never in this life go on as an Adventist by dismissing the whole thing and washing my hands. I'm not saying that Ehrman does, but I am speaking for myself. Revelation reminds me powerfully along a timeline, but the timeline is simply, I think, a tool for alerting me to deeper issues. The seriousness of my decisions in life, the seriousness of what it is to call oneself a child of God, the seriousness of our responsibility before the universe, the seriousness of ethical and moral decisions. And whenever it's tempting to just wash my hands and just blow it all off and say, yeah, I don't, Revelation reminds me of my accountability to God. That is the first thing I would say. Now, there's probably more to add, but whatever I would have to say would have to start, I think, with that. In a way, your question is asking me, why read Revelation at all? And I guess in some ways I would ask that of Bart Ehrman. Okay, Bart, why do you even read Revelation at all? And he acknowledges that he does still read it, and he teaches classes that include a revelation, a reading of it. I don't know if he would answer the same way I do. I don't know, but I'm speaking for myself. Revelation reminds me of the eternal weight WEIGHT, the weight, the heaviness of my accountability in this life for eternity. Yeah. Does that help a little?
Yes, because sometimes, I think what gets lost in presentations about, who sees things in which way and how, we lose this personal relationship with the book that we have all read
Yeah.
probably many times.
Yeah.
And I think each of us has a view that is slightly different.
Yeah.
But I think that each of those is a part of a tapestry of the meaning that we can bring to each other and, have a maybe fuller picture. So
Yes,
thank
I
you.
agree. And I don't think Ehrman would speak of tapestry the way that you or I would. I think he feels your revelation is pretty univocal, and hence his problem.
Yeah, I think that's a very common problem in
Mm,
theology in general,
mm,
that everybody feels that they're holding the corner on truth
yeah, mm,
without maybe
mm,
giving a possibility that we are just having some insights into it and that we all contribute to it to some
mm,
extent.
mm.
Thank you. So I'm giving it back to Monty for other questions and comments. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm looking forward to our discussion. To get us started, I want to just remind people of some of our guidelines. First of all, we tried this last week, going with a comment and a question, because many of us often have a comment that we want to add in addition to our question. 2 items. And so to balance that, if you don't have a comment, we are allowing 2 questions. So comment and a question, or 2 questions per turn in the queue. And I ask that you self-enforce that rule so that I don't have to. And in terms of priorities, if we end up getting crunched for time, that first times in the queue will have priority, as well as working towards some gender balance in people within the queue. With that, I am going to go to the only person I have in the queue thus far, and that's Anastasia.
Thank you so much. Happy Sabbath. And I appreciate all the work of Simona and you and everyone that makes this class possible to continue. Thank you. And please remind me, as I'm a Greek and we like to talk for long time, so please remind me to stop. Dr. Jones, I thank you so very much. I want to tell you what a blessing it is. I am, from my personal religious and cultural experience, I have, as I said to Dr. Larson, I came to this country in '66 after going to Newbold, which I loved very much, what I learned and experienced there. I'm a practicing Eastern Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, but ever since '64, actually, with the help of God, I've been keeping the Sabbath the way Jesus intended, as well as celebrating the resurrection of our Christ on Sunday. Also, as a profession, actually I changed profession from medicine to comparative literature. I appreciate also very, very much your extensive work with cultures and language, because of course, I'm not objective. We need it so very much. And your knowledge and sensitivity really, I believe, supports and opens roads for people to really know the true Christ, was mostly his love. Having said all that, also people like you and Dr. Thompson and Jim and Roy Branson and Dr. Larson, that they open the doors to people like me and others. And I have been able, after almost 50 years married to my husband, we had encountered some he was protective of me, because as early, not because of pastors, the wonderful pastors in Loma Linda, but still there are people today, even 4 or 5 years ago, They will make comments about the mark of the beast. Some of my family, they observe that, they will never see creation, so on and so forth. At the same time, back in the 60s, when we had the junta in Greece, the heart team went to Greece. My father was so delighted to welcome them and help them, and the people of Greece, because they saved so many little children, teaching Greek doctors, and for free, curing babies with valves and so on and so forth. The love of Christ, and opened really Adventism. I had no problem with my Greek family in Greece, telling them that I was observing and I was an Orthodox and an Adventist. But here, I have had very difficult times. And mind you, Loma Linda is very different from elsewhere. Hard time to bring them in anything. The wonderful thing that the Adventist church and Adventist people bring, but this book of Revelation will come up, and being apart rather, and denouncing your culture, denouncing your language, denouncing, has kept them away.
Yeah.
When I mentioned that a few weeks back to this class, someone, a wonderful gentleman, we agreed on so many things, but he said, no, that was because, in my experience, it's not. And Dr. Townsend said only 1% of today's Adventists believe that all this distraction and carnage is not from God, that God does that and not the evil. So there are still things. So coming back, I'm saying too many things now. I want to tell you how healing, how wonderful, and how courageous of people like you in this class is to bring this understanding of the true nature of God. And that kenotic idea, the kenosis of the Orthodox is the emptying and going in front clean and nude of our soul to say, please teach me, forgive me, and let me be loved. And I want to thank you this class and the opportunity, because I know that my wonderful husband, so protective of me, has been listening to this. And I'm proud now to bring my rest of my family to listen to this. So thank you.
Well, I can only thank you for your perceptive insight and for your encouragement. And I think while I'm thanking you, I must also thank you for your patience with the shortcomings of your fellow Christians, particularly within our Adventist faith tradition. You don't need me to tell you that we have a long way to grow, and we thank you for helping us grow. Yeah.
And we all do, and I do. Thank you.
Okay, I do not have anyone currently in my queue. I don't see visibly raised hands. I don't see, oh, we've got one there. I believe that would be McKinley. McKinley.
Thank you very much, Monty. I was waiting for others to join the queue since we are sort of in this teaming role of facilitating things. But nevertheless, I've got a question and maybe a comment as Monty has recommended. So first, Dr. Jones, thank you for this thoughtful talk. I think you have done what Hebrews encourages Christians to do, which is to dig deeper. And thank you also for the serious and reflective way in which you answered Simona's question. Here is my question, and then I'll give the comment later on. So without being too critical about the author, I think the author seems to be confused about the message of Revelation, and not playing the role of a psychologist, but do you have any sense of what might account for this apparent confusion?
That's a good question. I would like to I would like to legitimize the question. I don't know. I think my first, this is not an answer so much as a remark. I think it would be maybe a good idea to get his book and push through it, which is an easy read. It's not technical. It's written for lay readership. And then see if your conviction remains with you, and it may, that he's subject to some confusion. But if he is, my guess is that it maybe comes through the particular trajectory of his life, having walked in having worn different eyeglasses at different times in his life. Maybe that has left some residue, yeah, could we say, of this perspective and that perspective, this way and that way. I don't know. Do you have any impressions of where this morning, as we've talked about him, are there any particular aspects of his confusion that strike you? What prompts your question?
Yes, thank you very much. And I think it will come in my comment. Here's the comment, Monty, and forgive me for a few minutes. I'm always mindful of the scope and perspective of commenters and how that feeds into their commentary, meaning the limitation of one's scope and perspective can affect and influence how they see and reflect on a certain topic. Yeah. I continue to be baffled by how some commenters like Bart do not see the love of God and the restorative nature of Revelation, when it seems to me, in the end, Revelation is about healing the earth and the universe. In fact, I think chapter 21 talks about the tree of life being there for the healing of the nations. And that healing of the nations, who's that? Oh,
isn't that interesting? Yeah.
Okay, somebody's phone. Okay, and so the healing of the nations, I think, doesn't only refer to the future when Christ comes back, but also even now. And for the present, I think more importantly, I find that the healing message of Revelation, when it is taking into account the ecological needs of our earth today, I find that combining an expansive view of the Adventist health message and the idea of Sabbath with this healing vision of Revelation presents some solutions to the ecological challenges of our planet. And I think a person like Dr. Ehrman, I think is his name, lacks that perspective. And let me just expand this just a little bit more, Monty, forgive me here. So, as you are aware, there are many experts looking at how to address the climate issues that the Earth faces. Most of the approaches that are under consideration are of a technological form. They're looking to technology to solve these challenges, but these technological approaches might have some limitations in themselves. On the other hand, lifestyle approaches such as we practice and others have articulated could hold some of these solutions that the healing vision of Revelation espouses. And so, because I think Mr. Ehrman lacks this type of a perspective, he doesn't see that healing vision in Revelation, which is supported by the love of God and the love of Christ.
Yeah. Good, thank you. I think I think what I must do is amen you on this. Give you my amen there, and I would like to listen in on a conversation between you and Bart Ehrman.
I'll be very happy to have that conversation.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Thank you, though. That's important, and I'm glad you added it to the list of Hans Gutierrez and Sigve and Kendra as example of Adventists who might have a perspective to enrich the conversation a little. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, McKinley. Peter.
Thank you, John, for your challenging presentation. I listened an interview of Bart Ehrman about his book, a recent interview. And I should say that I was a little disappointed with him. First of all, I didn't like his tone. He was not exactly talking like a scholar in a serious manner about this. And he was very dismissive about the book of Revelation. Well, he emphasized strongly that he is not a Christian. And we have a very interesting example here. We have a man that is teaching something that he doesn't believe in. And I read most of his books, and among others, he doesn't believe in Jesus' resurrection anymore. And many other things. But anyway, it's interesting to see how a man that was a strong believer in God evolved in the opposite direction, that he doesn't believe in God anymore. Of course, we can say a lot of things about that. But the question that I have is that you mentioned 4 ways of interpreting Revelation. And also you mentioned that Sigve Tonstad in his commentary, he is not very consistent in his methodology of interpreting Revelation.
I would say he's inclusive.
Yeah, it sounds different. More friendly, more inclusive. And the Adventist commentary, it's kind of the same. Well, I'd be interested in your view, which of the 4 methodological things of interpreting the book do you favor? And if there is an official way of the church to interpret the book. I should mention also that you mentioned that basically the interest in Revelation started not only with the French Revolution, but is going backwards to the Reformation and so forth and so on, starting basically from the 4th century on, they were interested in the book of Revelation. But talking about the Reformation, I just want to mention Martin Luther, that believed that Pope, he considered him the Antichrist. What do you think of
it? Yeah, so maybe I should start with that. Well, let me first just add a quick footnote. Yes, I think Ehrman has had his own pilgrimage, and it's not mine, and it's not ours necessarily. I still think there is a value in, first of all, I think maybe in the YouTube videos, maybe he is more, he is less reserved than what he writes in a published book. I don't know. But I think he's being completely honest. I believe that does represent his position now. I guess I would say I still think that there's some value in listening to him. I don't have to agree with him, but I don't have to refuse to hear his voice either. I think there is a perception there that I appreciate. I'm glad I read him. I feel I have benefited something from his insights, as I've indicated. Now today, yeah, I guess I wouldn't, I guess I would differ from Sigve in this way. and this way. And it's not an argument against him, it's just where I am. More than Sigve, I would privilege, or at least I would begin with, the preterist view. I still feel that that whatever else I'm going to see in Revelation, I think I owe it to the author to ask, first of all, what did he understand himself to be talking about in his time and place? That, however, does not preclude any of the other three. His continuous historical, which has been a classic Adventist reading since Uriah Smith, but also the symbolic idealist way as well. I think the preterist does not preclude the other approaches as well, and gives them a certain legitimacy. They have spoken powerfully in our lives as Adventists, and I think we need to acknowledge that and preserve a place, a role for those. But I always, my instinct is to always start with the preterist.
Yeah, I believe Bart is favoring the empire, the Roman Empire, as the focus of the book.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I will have another question when my time will come.
Okay. Fine.
Thank you, Peter. I'll put you back in the queue, definitely.
Yeah. And I want to say thank you, Peter, for that. I appreciate it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Simona.
So, John, in your comments about the revelation, you mentioned that you sometimes struggle to accept the view of the gospel, Jesus in the gospels versus the view that we see in the revelation.
Mm-hmm.
I do not have the same problem.
Mm-hmm, 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 mm-hmm.
In a way, it's a continuum of the same thing. And if you look at the revelation, I really appreciated what Sigve said, that, we see Christ as a victim of violence. It's a continuum. But that's not the end of the story, just as the crucifixion is not the end of the story. Somebody this morning in another group that I attend mentioned how in most churches that we know, Protestant churches, the cross is empty because Christ is resurrected.
Yeah.
While in Catholic Church, Christ is still on the cross because that's the focus, is on the crucifixion. And I think that in a way, the revelation takes us one step further. It takes us to the outcome of the resurrection. Not just the resurrection of Jesus, but resurrection of the world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And the healing that comes as a result of that resurrection. So as I think Sigve also said, almost all the violence and I think all the violence that's mentioned in this book is basically done by somebody else. You see these, you see victims of the violence who are now praised, and they are the first of the crop. They are, raised up. You see Jesus, who is the slain lamb, who is now on the right side of the God. You see, so these are, I think, all the images of restoration that come after the violence that we are all living through. So it doesn't negate the reality of our lives, so the reality of life on this planet, but it goes beyond that, and it takes us one step further and says, well, I have conquered all this, and there will be no death, and there will be no tears, and everything will be restored, and resurrected. And so I think that we spend too much time on blood and gore that is so familiar to us in our daily lives.
Yeah.
And we fail to see the message. You know, it's like reading a book, and instead of looking at the end of the book to see what is the message of the book, you open a page in the middle and you take your cues from there.
Yeah. Yes, that is a healthy reminder and a valid one. I accept that. You are correct to quote from the latter part of the book, I have conquered, I have overcome. I think Ehrman would then say, yes, that's right. But what shall we do with the middle of the book in which God calls the redeemed people and tells them, go forth and conquer. And so at that point, I think Bart Ehrman is standing outside of the implied reader, and criticizing the text instead of just going along with it. Yeah, he asks, of course, even in the Gospels, he does not take his hand off. He does not hold his hand over the passages that say, yes, there is eternal price to pay, and there is damnation and so forth. But I think he feels that Revelation, unlike the Gospels, revels in endless on and on, if not endless, at least on and on suffering, and he's asking, is that really God? How are we to understand that? I do think we should acknowledge to our Catholic friends that, yes, the empty cross is a powerful statement, and the Christ on the cross is a powerful statement. But many times Jesus in Roman Catholicism is also represented, glorified as the Christus redivivus, Christ having risen from the dead again. Our Catholic friends don't always leave him on the cross. After all, we need to just acknowledge that, I think. But yes, I guess finally, this presentation today must be taken more as an invitation, a critique in some ways, but more as an invitation. His book is not expensive and it's not hard to read. And I would encourage each of us to pick it up either in Kindle form or in a hard copy and just read it for yourself. And then step back and say, Bart, if I were having lunch with you, here's what I would want to say to you. Yeah, thank you.
Peter, back to you in the queue. Thank you for waiting.
Thank you. Well, Don, I know that you have very interesting hobbies, and one of them it's you are interested in these fascinating places like Silk Road and Tibet. Well, if I may ask you in regard of Tibet, if you can tell us a few interesting things about this, because for me, I was looking at Tibet always as it is described basically in the revelation for the church of Thyatira, where it says that you have there the deep secrets of Satan. And if you can tell us a few things about this, because you're very interested in Asian religions and yeah, if in addition to the way they are choosing Dalai Lama, that I know about that. But if you can add a few things about their very interesting things.
Well, Peter, that is a tempting invitation. Perhaps it casts our net a little more broadly. I'm happy I'm happy to say a word or two if you like, Peter.
Sure.
Do we have some concurrence around the circle? It's moving beyond our topic of the day.
Yes, please
That
go
does
ahead.
not.
I do not have anybody else in the queue,
Okay,
so
all right. Fine.
sounds like a
Okay.
fun way to wrap things up.
Well, good. Well, a couple of quick little thoughts. Yes. You know, it's fascinating to ask questions as we have done in our tour groups sometimes. Okay, here we are traveling through Tibet, which is deeply, deeply Buddhist, with some Hindu backgrounds behind all of that. And oftentimes the group members would ask questions like, how do we find common ground? How do we find a way of talking with these people? How do we share what we have to offer? Well, I think the answer begins, first of all, with the fact that God gave us twice as many ears as mouths, and that we should always begin by listening twice as much as we speak. And I think that would be a good principle to begin with. But as I engage in conversation with Hindu friends and with Buddhist friends, I find that one of the most readily understandable common ground is the idea of the incarnation, because Buddhist and Hindu understandings, in particular, let's start with the Hindus. Hindu understandings of divinity includes places of real incarnation for them, in which Vishnu comes into this world as Krishna, for example, with some very specific spiritual lessons to share. And that is the basis on which they listen to him. And that the various Hindu divinities represent different aspects of God. We would say represent different aspects of the one true God, and they would say, well, of different divine figures, but those different divine figures, whether Vishnu or Brahman or Shiva or whoever, can also be taken back to the oneness of the divine as well. The Bhagavad Gita speaks of the fact that that there is one God, while the wise ones, the wise teachers, call him by many names. And so there is at least the foundation of a conversation there. Now, that can only get you so far. I'm not pretending that that's a final answer, but it's an initial answer. But a little more. The great caravans on the Silk Road, as you know, Peter, went back and forth, particularly in the first 1,000 years after Christ, but they started even earlier, trading between India and China, but also China and India, but also China and the West to some extent. These were long and dangerous journeys. But the fact is that in the certain gathering places where the caravans would gather to rest the camels and water the horses and so forth, the people would share ideas, and they would talk with each other and say, well, my God believes this way. What does your God believe? And one of those places is in an area known as Dunhuang, which is a fascinating place because for thousands, literally thousands of years, it consisted of many caves which believers in different religions had carved out some chapels and caves and meditation places for themselves. And in one of those caves in the early 1900s was discovered a sealed wall, which, when broken through, first of all by Sir R.L. Stein, British explorer, he was originally born Hungarian, was discovered to contain thousands, literally thousands of ancient manuscripts. many of them dating from about 500 years after Christ, rolled up and sealed in that cave. Now, it's been a tremendous job to decipher, because they're in more than a dozen languages, and some of the manuscripts are in very poor condition. The British Museum and others have been working for years to try to put these back together and read them. But what is particularly interesting to me is that 3 of those manuscripts are clearly Christian, They tell the story of Christ. They tell it in terms meaningful to Central Asians. I'll give you an example. One of the names of Jesus, it is used several times, is the name the world honored one, world honored, hyphenated, we would say, the one who is honored by the world. He is called the world honored one. Well, that's interesting in itself, but it's particularly interesting because that is an earlier name that has been consistently applied to Buddha. It was first used for him. Now, isn't that interesting? We could ask questions about, oh, well, they should not use a title from another faith tradition to apply to Jesus, but they did. And when we go back in our Bibles to places like Psalm 39, for example, here we find Yahweh, God, described by titles and characteristics and qualities that belong exactly, are you ready for this? Exactly to Baal, the enemy. Yeah. And it's a way of saying God is greater than Baal, greater than Baal. And sure enough, God is called the one who is in charge of the storms and in charge of the fertility and all the rest. And I suppose if the psalmist can do that, maybe the early Christians in the Silk Road could do that also. That's one of the lessons I learned from them. I don't know if this is interesting to you, Peter, or not, or to the rest of the group, but you push my buttons on that. So, yeah.
Wow. Thank you. Peter, did you want to do any follow-up on that, or shall we turn it back to Simona? Very interesting.
You're muted, Peter.
No, I don't have a further comment.
Yeah. Thank you for your question, Peter.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Mm.
All right, Simona, I see that Eduardo has raised his hand. I'm going to leave it to you whether
Let's give him a chance since he hasn't spoken. So Eduardo, please go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you, John. It caught my attention how difficult it is to have a conversation with these Orientals religions. I noticed that God identified himself in the book of Isaiah. And the way he showed his credentials is, and actually he's challenging other gods. And the challenge is show us the future. In the way that he identified himself as the one that shows the future.
Yeah.
And I think that it will be a good way to cut their attention, because through Daniel and Revelation, and actually I use this argument when I talk to atheists that they don't believe in God. And I said to them, somebody came and said, an angel appeared to me and told me that in about 2,000 years is going to happen this and this and that. And if the 2,000 years pass by and we come to the conclusion that this was correct, I mean, who has the power to tell you exactly what's going to happen except God? That's my comment. Thank you,
Yeah.
John.
Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Thank you, Eduardo. Yeah.
Okay, Simona, I turn the time back over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, John, again for this a wonderful presentation and discussion.
Let me just insert an appeal that we all make a point of getting a Forrest's presentation next week. He and I have talked and agreed that we would each share somewhat different things. So I think it's fair to Forrest and fair to Ehrman, even though Forrest does not agree with Ehrman in every case, even more than I do. Let's look forward to getting part B, the second half of this series next time, and I'll look forward to seeing you then.
Thank you so much. And we are also looking forward to seeing Forrest back again. We haven't seen him in a while.
Yeah.
So at the end of today's presentation and discussion, I would like to leave us with something a little bit different. I don't know where we all are in our lives and what's happening with us, but there is this wonderful poem by Edgar Albert Guest called "Don't Quit."
Mm.
When things go wrong, as they sometimes will, when the road you're trudging seems all uphill, when the funds are low and the debts are high, and you want to smile, but you have to sigh, when care is pressing you down a bit, rest if you must, but don't you quit. Life is queer with its twists and turns, as every one of us sometimes learns, and many of failure turns about, when he might have won had he stuck it out. Don't give up, though the pace seems slow, you may succeed with another blow. Often the goal is nearer than it seems to a faint and faltering man. Often the struggler has given up when he might have captured the victor's cup, and he learned too late when the night slipped down how close he was to the golden crown.
Mm.
Success is failure turned inside out, the silver tint of the cloud of doubt. And you never can tell how close you are. It may be near when it seems so far. So stick to the fight when you're hardest hit. It's when things seem worst, then you must not quit. Now, blessing for the week. May your day be blessed by moments of quietness, light in the darkness, strength in your weakness, grace in your meekness, joy in your gladness, peace in your stillness. May your day be blessed. Thank you all for your participation today, and may you have a good week ahead. See you next week.
Thanks. Happy Sabbath, everybody.
Thank you, John.